Welcome to Monarchist Minute, royalist news and discussion out of the good old US of A. We have a deep intellectual topic tonight, but before that, we have an important word from our leading sports authority, Victor.
Well, it's not exactly Spain and England, not the United Kingdom, Spain and England are playing in the Women's World Cup final this Sunday. And the Queen of Spain will be in attendance representing Spain. No one from the British royal family is scheduled to be in attendance at the game in Australia. And that's not what I wanted to talk about necessarily. One of the female bishops in the Anglican Communion essentially granted a mass dispensation to the entire Anglican Communion from the obligation to attend their church on Sunday so that they can watch the women's soccer game. In an era where you can DVR live sporting events and catch them at your leisure. Did I mention that the Queen of Spain will be in attendance? I believe I did. Speaking of the Spanish royal family, Princess Leonor, the Princess of Asturias, the Spanish equivalent title to the title of Prince of Wales, has begun attending military training at Zaragoza. And that is your brief little roundup.
And this is the first and last time that we will mention the Women's World Cup. Because, well, anyways. Okay, well, some of you more astute viewers or older viewers, or whatever you want to use, I don't care, may remember Vicent, a man who last we spoke to him on the podcast, I believe he was discussing his college dissertation, or his thesis, sorry. So he is here. He offered us a very brilliant question or topic for discussion when I asked for intellectual topics when I started this intellectual crusade over a month ago, I believe. And now that he has a chance to come up, I will let him explain his question so we get into the discussion.
Yeah, sure. Well, when the call for questions was given about a month ago, I happened to be reflecting on the time about some of the press coverage that King Charles III was getting. And it occurred to me that, at least in the opening stages of his reign, he appears to be, certainly relative to his predecessor, and arguably in general, notoriously unpopular. Unpopular in the press and unpopular in general. It occurred to me that this seems to be part of a larger pattern that we see in history of monarchs whose predecessors have long, stable reigns being unpopular. Now, that can be explained away simply enough by saying, well, long-reigning rulers who can bring stability to their nations will be popular by their very nature, and it becomes difficult for their successors to live up to that standard. But I don't think it's that simple, or at least if we assume that it's that simple or paint with such broad strokes, then we have to look at the press coverage that Charles III is getting and just simply dismiss it all as being wrong or reductive. We have to say that Charles III is unpopular not because of who he is or is like, but because of who he's succeeding. We have to say that he's not irreverent or that he's not sort of uninspiring in ceremony. Which is a difficult point to argue up against the coverage that we've seen so far. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking back at other examples in history. The example I gave when I asked the question was George IV. And doesn't George IV have a very similar reputation? A long-standing crown prince, a successor to George III, who, while not particularly popular in America, was popular in Britain and served for a very long time. I'm thinking of Louis XV and perhaps the more notorious Louis XVI. being successors to the very famous, very powerful, and very popular Louis XIV. And I'm asking myself, does the position of crown prince become a bad influence on those holding that title, specifically if they're made to hold that title for a long time? Does having the proximity to ceremony that crown prince gives you, while not having the responsibility of real rulership, cause members of the royal family to become irreverent or decadent or simply tired of it all? And if that's true, what's to be done about it?
If no one objects, I would like to lead off.
Please.
Sure.
Well, I'm not sure the way that the media has reacted to Charles III. I'm not sure that it's due to any fault necessarily of his own, because he seems to be a man who wants to get more involved. It doesn't seem like he has taken being stuck in as Prince of Wales for all this time lying down. If anything, he seems to be the opposite, because even while he was the heir apparent, he used soft influence to get change done. Apparently, there were the media in the, I can't remember if it was the 80s or 90s or a different time entirely, was concerned that the people had gotten, or that he had written these letters to these different companies, and everyone was assuming that he was going to come out looking like an idiot. But it turns out he was actually being very helpful, trying to use influence to get people to, actually help the subjects of the realm. So I think with Charles III, we're not necessarily seeing the fear, well, not fear, but the observation described, I would say. I think that this is more of a unique circumstance of reacting to the concept of a king who actually wants to do something. But as for the what is to be done about this, because I do think that there is a very great danger of somebody becoming complacent in a role if he's had it for too long. I think that a title like Prince of Wales, if it actually means something, in would be beneficial. So to apply this in an American context, we could have the I don't know, the Duke of Maine or something, and the heir apparent actually has to do governance work in Maine while he is in charge, listening to the subjects and all of that, as well as a career in the army. And I think that those are two ways to do that, because that merges both the more modern role of a king with power, in that he's going to be dealing with not necessarily legislative matters, but matters pertaining to the civil side of the state, as well as the king's traditional role in military matters, which is something I advocate for strongly, anyways, and a return to royal figures actually leading troops in the battlefield after being trained through officers' corps, of course.
If I
Yes.
may interject, I think
like an
another possibly interesting position a young prince or crown princess could have would be as Secretary of the Interior, the person in charge of all the national parks.
Interesting.
Make a career learning how to appreciate our nation by guarding our natural treasures.
I actually like that idea. I think maybe something similar, because maybe not just interior, but maybe putting them in some position in cabinet, or maybe actually, I just had an idea. Maybe instead of just having them sit around and go to ceremonies and do public appearance, they could, like you said, serve in a public, like, cabinet position to whatever, except they rotate through positions. Like, they go to say, like, we'll use the US for example. Say they do Secretary of State for a year, and then they do Secretary of Defense for a year, Secretary of
They have to job shadow each position so they learn what exactly is expected of each job.
and they keep switching until they become the monarch, because then it allows them to fully and better understand what everything is about and done. and all that kind of stuff. And it will give them more experience in ruling, because that's what kings used to do, was that they would often have their sons around for whatever advisory meeting, because every king had advisors, and he would have his son listen in and learn, and often his sons would be taught by these advisors, sometimes in different understandings, like that of war, that of nature, that of everything, really. So I think that actually, if applied to the modern day, and we stop treating monarchs as just ceremonial figureheads, we could actually have really good, powerful, strong monarchs that could run nations better.
It does occur to me that the question, the way I engineered it, was meant to be a loaded question in the sense that it does extend to the concept of the figurehead monarch as well. So we're talking about somebody who has who's connected with a lot of pageantry but doesn't have a lot of power. We can say that that's about being prince, but we can also say that that's the condition of living in the gilded cage of figurehead monarchy, just at least in part meant to touch on that. I think the idea of rotation of leadership is an interesting one. It occurs to me that certain details would have to be ironed out and codified. That is to say, do we want this theoretical prince to be in a state of continuous rotation until they eventually ascend to the throne? How long are they in each of these roles? When do they start in each of these roles, and what training is necessary? That is to say,
one of our viewers, Koshin, actually proposed something interesting, having them preside over a Senate or some sort of House of Parliament or whatever have you, depending on the government system. That's actually maybe not fully presiding over the Senate, but I definitely could see like having a special role in that, maybe being the clerk, or but definitely I think getting them into positions to learn, like monarchs today, even like with you mentioning Princess Leonor, like she has to do military service because most monarchs do military service when they are princes or princesses, so that they can learn the how to be a commander in chief. Well, do the same thing with ruling. Have them be in positions where they have to learn about how certain aspects of governance work.
It would be very, like, you can't get any younger. So the first thing to do would be the military training. Then after the military training is done, then they sit in on strategic command sessions with the highest levels of military command. They would sit in, take notes, ask any questions that they may have. Then after that's done, after a certain period, they would go to, I'm just going to use our different cabinets because those are the ones that I'm familiar with. After their time with the Department of Defense, they would go to the Department of Homeland Security and sit in on meetings, ask questions, that sort of stuff. And then they could go to the Department of Energy, they could go to the Department of Education, Health and Human Services. All of these kinds of shadowy type roles within the different bureaucratic departments of state. And then after they're done with all of those, if they are still the heir apparent, then they would sit in on cabinet meetings. Actually, the king should be sitting in on those cabinet meetings himself, but that's...
Well, it's possible that to some extent what we're proposing here is a vice president. I will mention that I noticed you used the qualifier of, well, I'm going to use our American institutions because that's what I'm familiar with as an example. But there's no reason we can't talk openly about our own American institutions. We are, after all, American monarchists, and I don't think any of us are proposing a complete overhaul of American institutions in service of our monarchism. A lot of these can remain in their present form. So there's no reason we can't Department of Defense. It's still the Department of Defense that we all know more or less as it is. But more to the point, it sounds like to some extent what we're proposing here is a vice president, right? By any other name.
Pretty much.
Honestly, I like it. Yeah.
Although I will say that I think that rather than necessarily any sort of codified rule, what's more likely to happen is that for the first few generations of the American monarchy, different traditions should be encouraged to grow organically. And among that, I rather than having, say, first this, then that, I imagine that what's more likely to happen would be that all of this is just a part of the heir apparent's education, as well as hopefully his siblings, in the case something unforeseen should happen. And in that sense, you see, I think we've gotten into our heads now with our compulsory education system, where the quality of the education varies, but education in this country and in most places is set up the same in general. Like, we're all used to the idea of, okay, first period is one class for 53 minutes or whatever specific time your school's worked out, and then the next class, and then religion, then science, then whatever. And we've gotten used to that, but that wasn't always necessarily the norm. And monarchical education, well, not monarchical education, education for the future monarch, was always more informal, and it always took into account the talking to the advisors and all of that, in addition to basic book learning, as we would say. And so I think that is the more likely way that this would develop, rather than any sort of formal process, a more informal, organic tradition that has about as much weight as a formal process, simply because in certain cultures, and hopefully the culture that we will build, you do tradition because it's tradition, and you don't question the tradition. You may question why we do the tradition, but ultimately you shut up and obey until it's explained to you. That sort of thing. So that's how I see it working.
Let me ask you a simpler and more perhaps incisive question that kind of cuts to the heart of the matter, which is there a limit on how long a single monarch should be expected to remain in power, even if that's a very high limit, something like 50 years? Is there a point where it becomes necessary for our king or emperor to yield power to their successor without necessarily having to die for that to happen?
I would say
Liechtenstein
no.
has a regency, if I remember correctly.
I would say that no, because firstly, of course, being a traditionalist fellow, I shut up and do whatever, walk like the Egyptian and all that. But I would suppose that presents a system where potentially there could be a legal, but in all senses of the word, practical coup, where the heir apparent, who may be a little mischievous, convinces the necessary people that his father is senile or something when he clearly isn't, and have some convoluted mechanism. And then my other problem with that is it would take the power of the monarch to declare himself unable to out of his hands and into the hands of someone else. And my concern would be who exactly gets that power, because if it's just the king's son, well, obviously there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there. And then if it is and then if it's like some sort of elected committee, well, then that could potentially be justification for a more anti-royal power government to essentially remove a king who wants to do his who uses his authority to potentially install a monarch who is a little bit more comfortable with the notion of just letting the Congress or Parliament do whatever it wants.
Well, for what it's worth, most of what you described are things that already happen, and historically and currently, whereupon we can sort of finagle the legal details about what counts as competency to rule, and use that to check who's in power. I mean, that already happens. I am more interested in the possibility that by putting a round number on it, and it is one of the things that may be necessary to create legal qualifiers for something like this, and perhaps anything that our podcast is at present missing, it's real legal thinkers, lawyers and law students. But putting that aside for a moment, it occurs to me that by putting something legally binding and specific in place for succession and competency, we might be able to circumnavigate some of these things. So to give the example of the senile king, or the theory of the senile king, can we push him away by trying to convince the public that he's senile? Well, maybe that's not necessary, or maybe that's less likely to be done if we say after 50 years his term of service is over. I mean, this is not as bold a precedent as it sounds, because it's what democratic countries are already doing, whereupon world leaders have a finite term of service, and this doesn't inherently cause succession problems, and it might solve them.
Well, I think we have to remember that we are not a democratic group. We are monarchists. We want a guy to, but not only a guy to rule. And, part of the thing about the monarchy is the king rules until he dies. And I think it's probably the biggest concern for me is like, say we've got, that like 1 in like 3 generations king who's super good. He's like the Giga Chad of all kings. Who go down in history remembered for being the best king this nation's ever had, or like the top 3. But then he hits like a theoretical age gap. I think that just sets up a situation where you could have a leader who is, poised to, a very successful ruler who is doing all the things right, and then he gets he's removed because of some arbitrary age gap that doesn't account, he's like, is he competent? Is he got senile? It's like age, just impaired his judgment.
Perhaps, sorry, Krieger, I was jumping all over you. But
let me just finish my thought real quick. So,
okay.
Yes, there are kings who rule too long and are too old, but I think it should be a voluntary thing for a king to decide, hey, I've been on the throne for so long. I am so old. The times have changed. My heir is more poised to lead this country in the modern day. I'm going to abdicate and just live in like a monastery, because I think one of the Russian tsars is like theorized to have done basically just that. Can't remember who it was. It was like very interesting to me.
But we have to remember, well, let me give the example of the 2 grandmothers in my life. They're around the same age. My father's mother, sharp as a tack. She may not be able to drive anymore, but she is still mentally sharp as a tack. My mother's mother, on the other hand, has dementia.
Ooh.
So, there is a difference in sort of mental capacity. Like, you can have wildly different mental capacities in your 80s. And I see that that dichotomy with both of my grandmothers.
I know.
Yeah, I'm fully aware of that, and we're losing a little bit sight of the original idea or the question that I was intending to pose here, because I'm not imagining a scenario where monarchs become senile after too much time and therefore have to be removed on the basis of mental incompetence. I originally posed the question as a rumination about the corruptive influence of the crown prince. And since this conversation has, or at least originally was, framed around giving our crown prince more responsibility as he matures, it seems to me possibly natural that as that responsibility continues to become greater, that it's simply necessary for them to step into the role. And even if they're stepping into the role that's currently being held by somebody who's already incompetent, I don't see, or who's already competent and who's doing the job well, I don't see that as a reason necessarily why their successor shouldn't step in, because we're taking for granted that that successor will be less competent, and why should that be the case?
I would say that I believe that there was a reason for a monarch ruling until death, and I think that it's a matter of maybe a matter of respect, where the king gets to decide his own time to go, and I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. Either you have a king who reigns a really long time to the detriment of the prince, or the king has to step out of the way so the prince can actually, get set in the office and do his job. I think that like those more traditional rules, like Prince of Wales and all of that, those are opportunities for the heir to actually exercise his power. So when the time does come, I don't think that in a hard limit on when a king should retire in favor of his son or abdicate in favor of his son is necessarily a good idea, because there's always going to be more for a king to do. And I think that in the sense that somebody who takes this job in the traditional sense of God gave me this people to rule and I'm going to be judged on how well I rule them, that someone who's fully accepted that would want to stay in it as long as he is possible for the benefit of his people. And I think that I wouldn't, and if I was faced with someone like that, I wouldn't want to take it away from him, even if his son was of the same mindset. I guess that's just my perspective on the matter. But
Now, of course, we also have to address the elephant in the room when it comes to Charles III's popularity, that Charles also grew up in a time where the media was much more rigorous and, I don't want to use the term invasive, but invasive is the term that comes to mind. Basically, he was under far more scrutiny under his tenure as prince than other historical crown princes would have been. Especially in regards to his first failed marriage.
She should have been queen, not that old hag.
Joe,
Well-
I'd like you to consider the fact that if she was still with him and alive today, she'd be an old hag. So,
I mean, have you seen Camilla? Especially in the royal.
I'm just saying that a lot of people still have hard feelings because of how popular Diana was, and so we gotta think about how the legacy of that is feeding into King Charles's popularity as well.
Yeah, I'm sure, but I'm interested in why I'm interested in why George IV suffers a similar condition, being the unpopular successor to a popular monarch. This was a time when I'm not even going to say that the media was less invasive, because they were plenty invasive in the late 18th and early 19th century. But this is another example of a similar condition that comes from time. So I don't necessarily know that Charles III's condition can be blamed on the times.
I will also point out for the record, in the case of Camilla, uh, the king and the Camilla have the Queen Consort have repeatedly apologized, and I believe they were very sincere. So that is that's just, I mean, that's not adding to the argument or anything. I just want to say that for the record, yes, what he did was wrong, and he freely admits it, and that is, and I can respect a man who does something wrong and acknowledges it's wrong without digging in his heels. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Well, speaking about George the Fourth, and I just quickly put up the Wikipedia page, so
Can I use
give or take some
Wikipedia?
salt. I believe that most of George the Fourth's unpopularity had to deal with his being a bit of a scandalous man in regards to his poor treatment of his wife. I think he spent a lot of money, but again, that was just from a quick
Pretty
Wikipedia
normal at
read.
that time,
So
I would say.
Well, they are similar in that respect as well, which is that they are scandaled by their marriages and affairs in particular. But that in particular could at least perhaps be written off as a coincidence.
Yeah. Also, I will take this quick aside to condemn modern society, because whenever you ask modern society about Diana, it's, oh, Charles was an evil, I can't say that word, he was
Evil
horrible,
man.
he did horrible things, and I can't believe he would do that to her, and blah blah blah. And then modern society, when you ask the average woman or man to not cheat, it's like, no, but they have to for blah 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 blah. Like, adultery is
And
always bad, no matter what.
we gotta remember, by the time their marriage ended, Diana was cheating on Charles too.
That's true. So, but I condemn modern society, which, like, they're so hard on the king for that, and then they're not hard enough on each other for it. Like, I've seen people excusing adultery because, in the case of one of my friends, his girlfriend cheated on him, and I saw the friends of this girl saying, no, but it was okay because he wasn't fulfilling her needs. No, it's never okay. Adultery is a bad thing. Don't do it.
I couldn't agree more.
If you're not happy in a relationship,
Leave.
leave. Don't be unfaithful, because one, that's only gonna make it harder when the relationship does fall apart. And two, it's just a wrong, horrific thing to do.
Plus,
can't
you
believe
And
we
what
probably
have
should
to
have
happens if
already,
they're married?
you probably should have figured this out before you were married, by
Yeah.
You really should have.
I mean,
Very true, very true.
But
Anyway,
while we're on the
aside.
topic of mistresses, the fact that George IV was famous for his scandalous affairs is definitely in contrast to George III, who was famous for being one of the few monarchs of his era who didn't have a mistress.
Who, George the Third or the Fourth?
Third,
Third.
the one that
Oh well,
lost us.
I was about to say, he was a little too busy. He couldn't exactly lose his wife because he was losing his mind.
And the
Well,
colonies. And the colonies.
I
Well,
will
I'm just
say,
saying, in a time where we had things like Versailles and all kinds of monarchs engaging in some kind of hedonistic joy, George III is remembered for being remarkably chaste.
I will say that as far as piety is possible for an Anglican, George III was.
Yeah, that he was close, but no cigar, as it were.
Yeah, even when I try to make a compliment to an Anglican, I can't. I just can't do it.
Yeah,
Well,
he
my
like
You're
choked.
far
purpose
too
here
gone then.
was to ask a question about and introduce the topic of succession and what we wish to keep and what we wish to change about recognized succession rules in existing European monarchies and in our own model for monarchy going forward. It sounds like there is a general among this podcast team that the best way to mitigate sort of decadence in the royal family is by ensuring that even those not necessarily in power are being trained and being given the experience and given the responsibility that they need and that they usually want in order to not become restless, but that this escalation of authority should never extend to the supreme office of the land until the existing king or emperor either dies or abdicates. Is that right? Is there anything people want
And I
to
mean,
add?
it's very similar. The idea is very similar in principle to what parents will do with their kids, just, the average person, which is where a parent will give their kid a bunch of like busy work, or they'll have them do homework or chores or whatever all day because they prefer that than their child going out and like, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, drugs, sex, whatever. So it's basically just I mean, that's what kings have always been doing. It's like, hey, son, I don't want you going and making a bunch of little bastard children. I'm going to give you a battalion and then send you off into some war. Have fun.
Yeah,
Does that mean
I
we
would
lose a
say
cookie?
No, because it's a proper term.
it's a. I'll allow it, but I begrudge it.
All right.
The technicalities. But I will say that I think that this is definitely a case where it's the wisdom of our fathers that we look at, and I know that Trav's going to do the formal announcement later, but we are doing, as you would know if you signed up to our MOA, link in the description below. Ooh, that uh, that I was writing an article for our new paper, and it was about the role of the hypothetical parliament or Congress or whatever we end up calling it. I'm partial to just using the term parliament because I don't know, sounds fancier than Congress, but that's just me. And I proposed this whole system, and it occurred to me for how it should work. And it occurred to me after I wrote this, and that I even wrote it in like a clarifying paragraph that ended up being longer than any single individual paragraph in the rest of the paper, that um, we can try as much as we want to write out these specific legislative systems or specific rules and whatnot to see how they work, for the ideal monarchy. And I think that in a way in a sense that's the wrong way to go about it, because what the best, when we look at least from my limited understanding, golden age monarchies, and maybe Vincent can point me in a better direction on this. What we've already see is that those monarchies have existed already for some time, and they've gotten in, and the systems have gotten in the swing of things to take monarchy and adapt it to the specific context of the people and the land and everything that monarchy is ruling over. So when we think of, the golden age of the Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of France in some form had existed for centuries at that point, and I think that for us, I think that while these ideas we toss around are very good and productive in the sense that it will give the future king time for thought, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be us looking at history, seeing what worked, what didn't, and the king in his, deciding to do this and that. We're essentially setting up the pieces as best as we can, but ultimately it's going to fall into place how it's going to fall into place. And all we should do, rather than focusing on writing out every single specific, we should focus on the broad strokes things, because tradition will eventually take care of those specifics in themselves, because we're just setting up the winding car, right? Those little push cars where you like go vroom 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 vroom, where you can kind of control where it's going to go in general, but the specifics you don't know. That's essentially what I think we're doing, and that's part of the reason why I advocate for more of the power to be, and certainly all of the authority to be because power and authority are two different things, to be in the king's hands. Because if we really do believe that a king can guide our nation, then we got to put our money where our mouth is and trust those fragile first few years into his and ultimately his family's hands. And hope, and if we're right and we pick the right guy, and it all works out through providence, that we'll have a pretty dang good system, and I'd argue it'd be better than any system we can come up with and write on paper. At least that's my thought on the whole, specifics thing, which is kind of off topic, but
I think the broad statement of principle is warranted here, because what I am trying to do by breaching this question, by framing it the way I have, is to say, is there something we want to put on paper here? And it sounds like in this case you're saying mostly no. We've made some statements of principle here about what we think the expectations for Crown Prince be, but it sounds like we're not really interested in putting anything to paper, except maybe some of these broad principles about the necessity of the Crown Prince holding a certain position of real responsibility and authority in addition to a position of pageantry. Now, you briefly alluded to, Charles, that by possibly adding historical context, what you described as Golden Age monarchy. Is that something you want me to do?
Please.
Okay, all right, because usually what we're referring to when we're referring to Golden Age monarchy in the modern European sense is we're referring to the era of enlightened despotism specifically. Not every nation is going to have the same golden ages, so to speak. They're not all going to have the same periods of peak influence, but there is a very clear correlation that historians use to describe what we sometimes refer to as the Golden Age of monarchy in particular, and that usually refers to as, that's usually what is used to refer to as the era of enlightened despotism. So the 1700s and to some extent the 1800s in particular, right? So the Golden Age of the French monarchy is usually attributed to the period of Louis XIV, so the late 1800s and the early 1700s. Similarly, we attribute the Golden Age of Prussia to Frederick the Great, which is in the mid-1700s, and Austria is usually connected to Maria Theresa and her successor, whose name is eluding me at the moment. Peter the Great is a figure. Pardon?
Franz Joseph?
Oh, no, that's 19th century, but you're close, because I do remember now it is Joseph II, I seem to recall. But we're talking about, once again, the 1740s through the 1780s and stuff like that. This is the era when feudal institutions are being dismantled, and they're being dismantled by king. This is going on in Great Britain as well. The Georges are doing this, as well as, to some extent, we can go back into the 1600s, we can talk about second being a very good example of a predecessor to or a prototype for the enlightened despot who reaches past or reaches through feudal institutions and in some cases bureaucratic institutions to govern over the people more directly. During this period, the period of enlightened despotism, the peasant class usually saw their oppressors as the nobility, the people who owned the land that they labored on and took from them product of their labor, usually without any appreciable form of compensation. So when kings, when monarchs reached past the nobility to govern their subjects directly, in some cases stripping away the powers of the nobility and, for example, abolishing serfdom. We see serfdom abolished in several different countries over the course of the 18th century by enlightened despots like Joseph II. And this is what we're usually referring to when we're referring to new monarchy or the Golden Age of monarchy. We're referring to a period when the powers of the nobility were being stripped away by the king and being replaced with a system of more direct rule. Now, we have to preface that by saying these kings had massive teams of lawyers and bureaucrats in charge of carrying out these policies. It's impossible for one man to rule as an island, but during this period, the decree of the king carried more weight because they were reaching past the people who, during the preceding centuries, held most of the power, that being the nobility. So that's the historical context that I can give you, best as I understand it.
Oh, it would appear that you and I have. I guess I should have prefaced what I specifically meant by golden age, and I suppose that would be the height of the political, religious. I don't know, institution.
You can just refer to it. You can just refer to it as Christendom.
Well, I mean, yeah, that was what I was saying. The political, religious institution of Christendom. Because for me, that was sort of my ideal in the sense that materially, obviously, it wasn't the explosion of progress that we started to see once we got to the Enlightenment. But at the very least, as someone who would have been in the peasant class, there would be a certain niceness in knowing that I may not technically own the land I live on, but I legally can't get evicted, unlike now where I can hypothetically own the land and then the government says, yeah, but that's just one specific point that jumped to my mind. But it's interesting because it's always important to clarify your words because, we jump to completely different conclusions there.
Well, I'm not jumping here. I'm giving you the terminology as it's generally accepted by the historians, or at least the historians that I have used as sources when, for example, reviewing and creating my master's thesis.
And of course, property rights and such aren't universal across medieval Europe. In England, even during high medieval times, free farmers that owned their own land were still somewhat common.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. I was just focusing more on the apparent disconnect. In other words, I need to read more contemporary histories in order to better understand the common terminology because.
Yeah.
Well, if you're interested in specifically the topic of civil service land reform, which I insist was in the 18th century and remains absolutely essential for a efficient and prosperous nation, we absolutely cannot live in or under serfdom in any of its forms. And to that effect, I would recommend looking into the civil service reforms of Joseph II of Austria in particular, or if you wish, I have a copy of Napoleon III's Extinction of Pauperism, which is a pamphlet on the topic of land reform and of in particular, idle land being held by the nobility, and not being productive because its purpose at the time was being used as a tool for a form of price fixing. So I can offer you those as specific sources if you want them. But that is outside the scope of this podcast. And I will offer the disclaimer that Napoleon III is from a different era. He's 19th century. But there are, I believe, reasonable parallels that one can make when talking about his approach and the approach of somebody like Joseph II a century prior to civil service and land reform.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, entirely to your point, we are talking about monarchism in the 21st century, and you're talking about how it's necessary to a monarchy in any time period. So I absolutely think the Napoleon III bit is actually useful information. And if you send those into the chat, we can actually get those links onto the YouTube video and wherever else we post this, so that people will be able to read that for themselves. And I highly recommend you do. I always trust Vicent with historical knowledge and such. As a very
provided it's a legal upload, because I'm very stingy about that.
Chuck seems to be our legal counsel, but
even though, as far as I'm aware, modern intellectual property laws really go back to Queen Anne, and as a Jacobite, I have opinions about that. But I got it in. Check it off your bingo cards, people. I got it in.
We really need to update
very,
that bingo card, come to think of it.
What
very
about
quick.
Captain Picard?
We need to update the bingo card, come to think of it. It's
Oh,
been
I
a
thought you said
while.
something about Captain
Yeah.
Picard.
Yeah. Very quick aside. Charles, Victor, do you guys know Fred Simon TLM on Twitter?
I
Yeah.
do know Fred Simon TLM. I follow him.
I just got followed by him on Twitter. I'm very
Oh,
happy.
that's awesome. Congratulations.
For those of you
Fred,
who
if
don't
you're
know,
watching,
yes, Fred, if you're watching, thank you very much. You're a great dude. Keep doing what you're doing. For those of you who don't know, he's just a very big traditional Latin Mass account on Twitter. Talks about it a lot. Very funny. And he trolls Father James Martin, which
Who's
is just
James
great.
Martin?
Oh,
Father,
let me get that one.
that
Oh,
is
Lord.
a
That's
discussion
Chuck.
for off the air.
Yeah, I'll tell you later. Anyway, where were
Join
we
us
on this?
for our post show off the air. No,
Father
I'm
James
not
Martin ain't. I mean, no.
So
Hold on, Chuck. This is the perfect opportunity. If you want to join us for more post-podcast discussions, where we will have funny talks about things that we can't talk about on the podcast, using funny words that Chuck won't allow on the podcast, you can join us in our Discord. Link in the description below.
Smooth. I like it.
So, do we have anything else to talk about as pertains to the whole question? Are there any of the specific rabbit holes we went down, or the original question? It's fun how topic conversations shift, don't they?
I actually have something to bring up after we're all done with this.
Okay.
It's a bit of late breaking news.
Oh, okay. So, before we get to that, does anyone have any opinions? Because I'm fine with keeping this conversation rolling for a bit.
What branch would the heir to the throne even join?
Customarily it would be the army, but given that America is currently, and hopefully will be for a little bit at any rate, the dominant naval power, that could be good. Although I think tradition, I mean, even when, Britannia ruled the waves, it was still more customary for the kings to join the army. And actually, George V and I believe Edward VIII also kind of broke rank with that by joining the navy. And I think George V and also Edward VIII had to have assumed names, so in case somehow German intelligence found a crew list, they wouldn't see,
Monarch.
Albert Windsor and Edward Windsor on the crew list and say, "Oh yeah, let's send the U-boats." Yeah.
Honestly, if a prince is to join any branch, they should join an air force, because being a pilot is basically the closest thing you have to being a knight in the 21st century.
Well, given that air-to-air dueling has kind of been obsolete since the 1970s, I don't think that that's the case anymore, unfortunately.
We're gonna have our first Space Force monarch.
Oh, glory! No,
The first monarch in a mobile suit.
to say what Krieger is going to say before he says it. Once we discover that aliens are not made in the perfect image of God, we will be conquering them and destroying them.
Yeah.
No. Don't tell me Emperor
By the way,
Oh yeah.
if in our lifetime we do discover that there is life outside of Earth and we learn to interact with it, I am so becoming a human imperialist so quickly. You have no
Warhammer
idea.
40k, here
As
we
long as
come.
you share room on the space
Oh yeah,
shuttle,
baby.
we can get
Warhammer
along.
40k, here we come.
Imperium of man.
Actually, I know this probably isn't Vincent's particular area of expertise, but given all the times the government has trumped up alien conspiracies, what are the odds that this most recent bout is just the government just pulling the wool over our eyes again?
That's what they're doing.
What most recent bout is that?
The what was it? Some army guy or Navy or Air Force guy confirmed that aliens existed or something in some congressional hearing.
Oh, I don't put any stake in that. I don't attribute any weight to it. First of all, it's not necessarily unknown for people like this to either make up stuff or misunderstand stuff. And then the other thing is that it's sort of, what does he actually mean by that? What does he actually mean by, well, I don't know exactly what was said. Did he say aliens? Did he use the term extraterrestrials? And even then, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean extraterrestrial beings, extraterrestrial life, extraterrestrial intelligent life? I mean, it was a time when we didn't know, or we didn't understand what signals pulsars were sending out. The first time SETI received a signal that appeared to have a pattern to it, they assumed that it was put out by extraterrestrial life before they realized it was actually being put out by a pulsar. So I don't attribute any weight to rumors of government contact with extraterrestrial life.
Also, I think just not even on the whole space idea of it. I think it's generally a safe bet to put, like, basically, if the government bets red, you better bet black, because the government almost never is truthful when they're telling us things.
And let's also not forget that the government, that the Roswell crash, the belief that there was aliens in the crash was actually a psyop, because the original government story that it was a weather balloon was actually true. Because before we had high altitude spy planes, we used weather balloons to spy on the Soviet Union. And one of these weather balloons crashed, and that's why they were out there, because they were trying to salvage the film. But they ended up using the rumor that it was aliens as a psyop to basically distract people from actually trying to research into US spy technology.
And I did hear one story, and I wish I remember where I got it from, where this one poor guy who lived near an air base was picking up this like weird radio signal, and it turns out that it was actually just like the airbase's encrypted signals going out. But he goes to the base commander and he's like, "Yeah, I found this, and could it be aliens or something?" And the base commander essentially led him down that rabbit hole, and the poor guy lost his mind because he thought aliens and all this stuff. So, of all the different crimes a military officer could commit, causing a guy to go insane because you convinced him that he was communicating with aliens probably wasn't the ones you were thinking of.
I
But
mean,
first time
if
for everything and all
they're,
that.
if they're willing to believe, I mean, the beliefs in UFOs came into extreme handiness when it came time to create the Skunk Works, and we needed something to write off all of our new experimental aircraft that we were flying at night.
But this is the interesting theory, right? Because throughout human history, there's always been some sort of beings that are a part of our culture in a real way. And I don't know if aliens are necessarily there yet, because I still think that most people think of them as, like, if they do exist, or on Omicron Persei 8 and speed of light and all that.
I understand that reference.
Yeah, if you do, then you should like and subscribe. No, anyways, no, but the thing is that there's this, because when it comes to what the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church hasn't ruled one way or another on things like fairies, because it's not necessary for your salvation that you believe in fairies or you disbelieve in fairies. But
Didn't
there's
the Pope
always
say
these.
he would baptize aliens if they asked?
I think. But another pope said, well, one guy.
Okay,
This
to
was
cut
during the
quote,
medieval period. Where this guy said, there's probably another continent out there with a bunch of other people, but by the time that I got to Rome, somehow by playing a game of like Chinese whispers, it got translated as there's life on other planets, and the Pope's like, no, you moron. So that's an interesting thing. Different popes have different opinions on this matter, I guess. But when it comes to the fairies, the theory is that whatever these things are, the fauns, the fairies, all these different creatures of folklore up to our present with the aliens is that they're all really the same thing. It's just that they change shape depending on the current circumstance of what the people believe at the time. And this isn't something I necessarily believe in, but a lot of it is when there's smoke, there's a fire, like with how every culture, or I mean, like, which saint was it? He believed he saw a fawn. Like he didn't just see one; he had a conversation with it. Was it Saint Jerome? I can't remember. But yeah, I don't know. That's just something for consideration. A lot of people are probably staring at me like I just grew a second head, but it happens all the time. So
Like a certain
that's how I
Rhode
yammer so much. I
Islander.
have two heads. What did you say?
Like a certain Rhode Islander when you said everyone's staring at me like I grew a second head.
Well, how do you think I talk so much? One mouth can't do all this flapping, right?
By the way, today is an interesting day to celebrate the creation of the Anti-Defamation League, a group of lawyers who tend to really just be the what I think they're the ones who classify hate groups, if I'm not incorrect, but they were founded 108 years ago to attempt to protect the rights of a man named Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a Jewish man who worked in a factory who did very horrible things to and then murdered a very young girl. And then he
Frank
attempted...
owned the factory.
Oh, yes, he owned the factory. My bad. Anyway, he then attempted to... Now, consider, this is like 1910s Georgia. He attempted to pin it on a black man who witnessed it. And he was so very obviously guilty that the KKK came out and said, "There's no way it was this black guy. It was you, Leo."
When
that's
you mess up so bad that the KKA starts defending a black dude.
But the ADL, when talking about their founding, talks about how they were on the other side of a case as the KKK. They refused to mention the fact that the KKK was defending a black guy. Oh, ADL, never change. Because you're so stupid.
So, do we have any...
Sounds like the definition of cursed unity right there.
one struggle? I don't... Okay.
I don't know how to do it. This is one of those fact or history is stranger than fiction kind of stories.
Dang, we really do need to start, when we say this stuff, we really do need to start having like sources at the ready, because there are going to be so many people who are going to yell at us. So if you could get that,
Yeah, I'll get the
or
source.
should I say Santiago Riviera? Because
whatever. Yeah.
we'll get to that at the end too. There's a lot of stuff we got to talk about at the end of the show. So do we have any thoughts about the fairies, crown princes ruling over the fairy? Yeah, there we go. That's a crown prince can get a governing experience. He can get the fairies to stop kidnapping people and dragging them off to fairyland for 1,000 years. Yeah. Does anyone have any?
In Fairyland? Maybe I want to go explore Fairyland.
Well, when you come out, if you come out at all, it's going to be like a couple hundred years later. So
maybe the world will fix itself by then. I don't know.
Well, no closing thoughts from me, Charles. My goal was to facilitate discussion, to introduce some new topics, and I think I've done that.
Yeah, it was great having you.
Yeah, you did, and it was very excellent. Thank you, Vincent. Now, for the bit of news that I received, I will be actually, because it's not really pertinent to the actual Monarchist podcast, I will be talking about that in the post-show public discussion.
Oh, bien. Well, which you can have access to if you join the Discord 3 days before the episode goes live. Well, 2 days and 16 hours. But there we go. So, I suppose that means that unless anyone has any final things, I will do the
we have an announcement.
we do have an announcement, but I got to do the muster because I forgot to do that as Santiago pointed out. So today, appearing on our podcast. Oh, right. Sorry. Appearing on our podcast, we had before we begin, Koshin did have one thing. The main people statement I remember about aliens is that if they exist, they have their own relation to God separate from us. In terms of fairy tale related stuff, my favorite stuff is an area around Romania, I think. They brought there were rat men who lived on the other side of the world. So on Christians, they painted eggs in the rivers, believing that they would be carried through the caves to the other side of the world to let them know when it was Easter, since they couldn't track it by the sun or something. That's kind of humorous. I like that. So thanks to Koshin, who's normally on the show but wasn't today. Thank you to Vicent, Victor, Krieger, Joe, myself. Thanks me. Everyone clap for me.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yay.
Santiago Rivera, who is our new human relations dude, and William for being here today. Thank you all for making this probably the most enjoyable podcast in recent memory.
Of course, it was a good time, and having Vincent is always a treat. Of the 2 times I've had him on, but yes. So I, Trad Raider, am now Santiago Rivera, Ajar for Moa, and being in that, I now have a new announcement for everyone who listens to our show who isn't in the server or is in the server and didn't hear about this. We are launching a newspaper for Monarchists of America. It's going to be a trial run at first, but should it do well, and should we continue to have the energy for it, we will begin to publish regular papers. It is called the Cavalier. It is edited by myself and Chuck, and we have a great team of writers, through 2 of which appear on the podcast today, Krieger and William Stout, who will both have articles in the first edition. So that should be put out before the end of this month, preferably before the next podcast. So keep a lookout for that on our website, on our Twitter, and in our Discord.
Right. And now for our regularly scheduled, fumbled outro. If you would like to join us live for Monarchist Minute, then you can join us on our Discord. Link
In the
in the
description
description
below.
below. If you would like to follow us on that one particular letter of the alphabet formerly known as Twitter, then you can follow us on the website formerly known as Twitter. Link
In the
in the
In the
description
description
below.
below.
we're Elon. We are calling it the artist. We're changing it to
The site formerly known
what
as
do you
Twitter.
the website formerly known as Twitter. You got to do it. You got to do it, dude. You got to. I'm serious. If you would like to visit us on our other various social medias, then you can do that by clicking on those links in the
In the
description
description
below.
below.
And now it is time to conclude in prayer. Will?
Please bow your head. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Right. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. So, until next week, may God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.